Hi, I'm Mike Lewin and I'm running for Manhattan Borough President. And this is our other bird gal. And of course, birds fly onto the land as well as in the sea. And this is very much a land bird. And the reason I bring it up is because today we're going to talk about land costs. So let me share the screen, show you my PowerPoint. So what do land costs have to do with anything? Well, as you know from my earlier videos, I've called for less zoning in order to increase housing supply and thus reduce rents. But some people argue that if zoning is more permissive, that'll just raise land costs, which in turn will actually cause rents to go up or go instead of going down. So what's wrong with this argument? Why do I not think that rising land costs will cause rents to go up no matter what? So the basic ideological assumption here is that if there's an upzoning, there'll be higher land prices, which in turn will lead to higher rents. So to see the problem with this, let's imagine a hypothetical. Imagine that you have an upzoning that allows a landowner to build 10 houses on a parcel instead of 2 houses. Or maybe to put in the urban context, let's say 100 apartments instead of 20 apartments. So presumably land prices will go up to some extent. That is to say, land will be more, you can build more stuff on the land, so you can make more profits from land, more permissive zoning. So that means there's more demand for that parcel of land, which in turn would mean that land prices would probably rise to some extent. In other words, that parcel is going to be worth more to a developer with 10 houses than it would be with 2 houses. But let's say for the sake of argument that land prices double. Well, does that mean that rents are going to double? No. And here's why. The landowner can charge lower rent for the 10 houses and still make a profit because it can charge lower rent for each house. So for example, let's suppose that in our hypothetical parcel of land prices double from $10,000 to $20,000. So even if the landowner reduces rents, let's say they reduce rents from $2,000 for the bigger houses to $1,000 for these 10 smaller houses, they can still have a much bigger profit. That's to say, for what $1,000 per house, they might make $10,000, whereas with $2,000 for the one house, they would only make $2,000. Thus, there's no reason to believe that rising land costs will always lead to higher rents as long as you can have more housing units taking up less land. Now, of course, we don't know for sure that land prices will only double. Basic assumption behind the kind of anti-housing, anti-upzoning argument is that land prices will always increase by as much as the number of units, so that the landowner will never make a profit by lowering rents. But I don't see any reason to believe that's the case. Could be the case, but it's certainly not necessarily the case. Second problem with this argument is if upzoning really did increase land costs enough to increase rents, then it would logically follow that downzoning would actually lower housing costs downzoning would actually lower rents by lowering land costs, right? That is to say, if you really believe that new housing led to increased land costs, which lead to increased rents, then logically when cities downzone, that is to say, when a city makes its zoning code stricter in a way that keeps out new housing or reduces the amount of housing, that city would actually experience lower land costs, right? Well, let's look at the facts. Los Angeles has downzoned its city by 50% over the past 60 years. As to say, in 1960, the city's zoning code was so permissive that you could have built housing for 10 million people if every parcel of land was zoned to its highest possible level under the zoning code. Today, the city's only zoned to support about 4 million people. So if upzoning increased land costs and housing costs, you would think that downzoning in Los Angeles would have led to lower land costs. In fact, that's not true. In fact, land costs have risen, housing costs have risen. Los Angeles is now one of the most expensive cities. Similarly, New York is on balance downzoned. How much is it downzoned by? 40% of Manhattan can now not be built under the current code. That's how much it's downzoned. Yet again, land prices keep going up. And I've supplied links to just describe the extent of downzoning in both cities. So in this PowerPoint, you see how much land prices have gone up. Just from 2012 to 2019, land prices increased by a little over 50% in New York. In Los Angeles, they nearly doubled. Another problem with the idea that upzoning leads to higher land costs and higher housing costs, you would think that would mean that the cities that allow the most housing would therefore have the lowest, or excuse me, would therefore have the highest housing costs and the highest rents. Because all this upzoning, all this letting people buy houses, you would think would increase land costs. So let's look at the facts. You have cities like Houston and Charlotte that have allowed much more housing by any possible measurement than New York in recent years. And those cities have also had rising land costs. So you would think those cities that allow so much more housing would have higher rents than New York City. And of course, this isn't the case. All you have to do is look at Zillow or Truly or any other website and see that even new housing units in places like Houston and Charlotte don't cost very much by New York standards, despite the fact that these places have higher population. So to sum up, one of the basic major, I think probably, in fact, I think it's actually the most plausible argument against upzonings is that more permissive zoning leads to higher land costs, which leads to higher rents. But the problem is, you think if that was true, then places that were more permissive would have higher housing costs, and they don't. So on that note, see you on the campaign.